One of the issues we're all facing is we're going to welcome 3 to 4 million more people in the corridor over the next 30 years. So the challenges that we're facing in affordable housing and congestion on our roadways and emissions promise to do nothing more than get worse. If we're not willing to step up to the challenge, if we're not willing to plan and to act in a timely way so that we can get out in front and ensure the quality of life we all want. So today you're going to hear from experts from both sides of the border. They're going to share with us kind of a landscape of the challenges in more detail, kind of the best practices, how to stand up to those challenges, and really how we must engage our respective communities, because they will be the key components to any success that we want to achieve for the future we all want. So with that, I want to turn it over to our co-chair, Kevin Desmond, CEO of TransLink in British Columbia. Kevin, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Governor Gregoire. Great setup. And I want to welcome as well the audience. I hope we've got a great audience from British Columbia, from the state of Washington, from Oregon, and maybe other places as well. And I expect and I hope this will be a really, really thought-provoking conversation here this morning. You know, even as we remain in the midst of this extraordinary pandemic, focused on the urgent here and now issues, and we all are contemplating what's the near-term aftermath of the pandemic. What are the possible lasting changes to society and interactions? We can't afford to lose sight of this great mega region's long-term future. You know, I run the big multimodal transit agency here in Vancouver, and yeah, I'm thinking every day about the here and now. I'm thinking the future of work. I'm thinking what's the implication for our public transit next year and the year after that and so forth. But we're also restarting our 30-year planning process that we paused a bit during the worst of the pandemic, because we can't lose sight of that long-term future, because it's so very, very important. Even if it's unclear, even if there are new uncertainties, that shouldn't stop us from thinking about the long term. Cascadia's three principal regions, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, are expecting to absorb 3 to 4 million people over the next 30 years, as you heard from Governor Gregoire. Where are these people going to live? Where will new jobs to support all these people be located? How will continued advances in high-speed communications affect employment and land use? We're certainly seeing that now, how quickly businesses throughout the world, certainly in North America, are retreated to remote work. And it's worked well in many respects, but is that sustainable? And how will that change things going forward in terms of how we interact, how we use land, how land is used, and where housing is, and how we'll get around? How will continued advances in high-speed communications affect employment and land use? How, in these already saturated congestion zones of Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, how will people get around over the next 30 years? And to echo Governor Gregoire's great comments, how will we preserve the wonderful natural environment that defines Cascadia while doing our part to reduce climate-changing greenhouse gas emissions? That the Cascadia Innovation Corridor is putting a marker down for regional growth, regional development, regional planning that's fundamentally based on a sustainable future. Well, today's webinar will consider what's at stake for our future, and particularly the intersection of land use and mobility planning in the context of a mega region concept that extends across county, state, and international borders. It's a tall order, to be sure. Such comprehensive extra-regional planning is not common in the United States. It's not common in Canada. In fact, there are not a lot of examples that we can draw from, examples of successful long-range planning of that nature. But as outlined in the Cascadia Vision 2050 report, there's an imperative that we act. And if we can envision how to act creatively, we can meet the challenges going forward. So with that, I want to introduce to you our three great speakers. Starting us off will be Eric Sparks. Eric is a principal with the Boston Consulting Group's Seattle office and one of the authors of the recently released report, Cascadia Vision 2050, how the Cascadia Innovation Corridor can serve as a global model for sustainable growth. At BCG, he primarily works in transportation, aerospace, and industrial goods. He has an MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth and has served as an aircraft carrier-based F-18 pilot in the U.S. Navy. Coming after Eric will be Alan Hart, founding principal of Via Architecture, which has offices in Vancouver, Seattle, and Oakland. Alan's 40-year career is focused on integrating transportation choices to create high-quality, inclusive, and equitable urban environments. Alan's work, including projects in Tacoma, Bremerton, and Vancouver, has been recognized by state and international organizations, including the United Nations. And then our third speaker is Kate Joncas, Director of Urban Strategy and Development for MIG. Kate leads strategic efforts for complex urban projects in downtowns, neighborhoods, and urbanizing places. She's an experienced urban planner who has led successful community developments as Seattle's deputy mayor and for years previously as the CEO of the Downtown Seattle Association. So with that, I want to turn it over to Eric to kick off this discussion. Eric, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Kevin. It was just as Kevin was wrapping up here, the sun peeked out in Seattle, and looking out across the sound and at the mountains, I'm reminded how truly incredible Cascadia is and how lucky we are to be in this region. And of course, it highlights, I think, for me, the importance of thinking long term and addressing some of these big structural challenges like sustainable growth. So with that, let's jump straight into it. Next, please. The governor highlighted this already, but our mega region has experienced pretty astounding growth, both over the last 30 years and projected over the next 30 years. You can see since 1990, we've added 3.6 million people, significant amount of GDP and median income. As a matter of fact, GDP and median income have grown over 2 times faster than Canadian or US averages. And if we look forward to the next 30 years, we see pretty similar trends continuing. 3 to 4 additional million people projected, significant growth in both GDP and I think, good news story, real median income as well. Over the last 30 years, that growth, though, has come obviously with both benefits, but of course challenges. Housing affordability, in other words, the amount that the median family will spend on housing has increased by 40%. Commute time on average across our mega region has increased by 52 hours. I mean, that's pretty astounding. That's almost a week of work days additional sitting in a car. And even though emissions on a per capita basis have effectively declined, transportation emissions specifically, our total emissions, which quite frankly is what matters the most, have basically remained flat. And so as we think towards the next 30 years, how can we address some of these fundamental challenges that come with, what is broadly a benefit of our growth? A little bit of a macro North Star question for us as we thought through the report from the beginning is, how can our mega region serve as a model for sustainable growth? I think the governor highlighted this already, but no other mega region has really even tried to define what does sustainable growth look like at the mega region level, let alone put in place, characteristics or objectives or goals or implementation plans, which is pretty exciting because it offers us an opportunity, I think, to really sculpt the space. Next slide, please. So as we think about what should the characteristics of a mega region or sustainable growth for a mega region be, there's been a lot of work done at the city, regional, even country level. One of the most popular frameworks is a World Bank framework with 9 characteristics. Things like inclusive and equitable access to healthcare and education, or access to jobs. Now, all these characteristics are fundamentally critical, but many of them are best addressed, quite frankly, at the regional, city, or even very close local level. And so we have to ask ourselves, what unique benefits does the scale and the interconnectivity of our megaregion to bring to address some of these 9 specific characteristics? And we landed on 3 that I think are really fundamentally critical here. And those are housing affordability, transportation, and climate. And we'll define and unpack each one of these in detail in a moment here. But it's interesting as you think about addressing these using the scale of the megaregion, these actually also were the 3 maybe most critical ones that our megaregions face as challenges right now. Extremely unaffordable housing in many cases, gross transportation and congestion, and quite frankly, emissions that are not decreasing nearly fast enough to protect our planet. Let's go ahead now and take a look at our megaregion and how we compare to a group of what we'll call peer megaregions. So before we flip over to the slide, we took a look across the planet and said, what are some megaregions where we can learn both good lessons and bad lessons, frankly, and how is Cascadia performing against those other megaregions? And we landed on 7 megaregions that were like in terms of knowledge-based economies, rapid growth, both in terms of population as well as economic. And more importantly, that growth is projected to continue into the future. Ideally, they have an international border to kind of parallel the unique benefits and challenges that come with that. And as I said, what we did then was compared our region against each one of those other peer megaregions. So let's take a look at that. Next slide, please. You can see, let me start out by orienting you quickly to the graph here. The report itself is very data-driven, but want to keep this as kind of high-level and clear insight focused as possible. On the x-axis, we have the transportation index. And this is effectively an equal-weighted index between congestion and total commute time. There are, of course, a number of other transportation metrics that are important, but these ones are very representative of the challenges that we face. And more importantly, or equally importantly, we can measure them both historically and compare them globally. On the y-axis, we're measuring housing affordability. This is simply a median monthly housing payment divided by the median monthly gross income. Excuse me. Generally, 30% is defined as housing burdened here. And you can see not many megaregions across the globe are consistently doing better than 30%. And then the bubble size is transportation emissions in CO2 equivalent. And this is per capita. In other words, the bigger the bubble, the greater the emissions. And so smaller bubble good, bigger bubble bad. As we plotted these 2 really interesting clusters, and almost I would say operating models or archetypes popped out. The first one is growing or building out. You can see this is typified by 2 megaregions, Texas Triangle and Charlotte, Atlanta. The names, I think, of the megaregions are great in some cases. Texas Triangle is composed of San Antonio, Houston, Austin, and Dallas. And really, actually has very strong housing affordability, relatively good transportation is measured across the index here. Importantly, though, you can see that it has really poor emissions, more than 2x the per capita transportation emissions of Cascadia, and much more than 2x compared to some of the other peer megaregions. This is fundamentally accomplished by you just continue to grow out in concentric circles, connect that with a bunch of big 12-lane highways. The downside is obviously not a lot of access to public transit. For example, across the Texas Triangle, less than 2% of commuters use public transit. Charlanta, even worse, and you can see that playing out very directly in terms of their average per capita emissions. On the bottom left, the other archetype or the other cluster here we can see is growing up. Growing up is effectively, more density and go up instead of go out. This is obviously typified by places like New York, Boston, Washington, the Bay Area, or SoCal. And of course, there are trade-offs that are to be made here in terms of the cost associated with both housing and, of course, the trade-off in terms of transportation. You can obviously see, though, based on the bubble size, that we have significantly lower emissions. Excuse me. And I think if we take a step back and we look at where does Cascadia fall on the spectrum here, Cascadia in 2005, right there in the middle. And in the last 15 years, we've tended to trend less affordable, more congested, longer commutes to work. Not surprising to anybody, I'm sure, on this call. But right now, we are fundamentally at an inflection point, which, I think we geographically lack the ability to go towards cluster one. In other words, building out, the constraints of water and mountains, and quite frankly, the way of life that we value out here keeps us from mimicking the upper right cluster. And so how do we then think about shifting our trajectory to gain those benefits while still realizing the aspiration of an environmentally friendly, of a low emissions mega region? Let's go ahead and take a look at what trajectory we want. We're not going to do anything different than what is out there already. But by the way, that includes a lot of incredible work that we are working on every single day. Things like Sound Transit 3, all the work on mid-sized cities, et cetera, densification around transit, all the great work down in Surrey to grow there. And even with all that great work, if we project the next 3 to 4 million people, where do we end up? Next slide, please. This is a pretty sobering graph, or at least as sobering as a graph can be by itself. When we take a look out at 2050, even with all the great work, all the arrows that are in flight already, you can see we end up in a place that we frankly do not want to be. We're going to have worse traffic congestion than LA today by 2035. We're going to be less affordable than New York or San Francisco by 2040. And to be clear, those are where they are today, not where they will be in 2050. But still certainly not something that I think we aspire to be. And unfortunately, even though our emissions will continue to decline a little bit, they're still considerably above Paris Climate Accord goals of 2050. And those are effectively, broken down for our mega region based on projections that we need to meet climate change goals. This is a little bit of a scary picture, and certainly I think not a place where any of us want to be. And so what big picture ideas, as we think about the next 30 years, what structural pieces can we put in place to change the trajectory or slope of the direction that we're headed on this graph here? Really fundamentally, what it comes down to is how are the additional 3 to 4 million people distributed and connected across our region? And so if you'll flip to the next slide, please, you can see that broad projections have us about 3.6 million people, additional people by 2050. A good chunk of those, just over 700,000 people, will be housed around densification, around already planned transit. In other words, what have we already put on the roadmap? Where are people going to be located there? How much densification will be structured around those? Mid-sized city growth will continue to house more people in a dense and quite frankly desirable way. I think there is still a lot of work to do to invest in our mid-sized cities, to continue to think about how we grow those in the right way. And then, of course, there's just a natural densification trend. If we look at historic densification trends, both across our 3 individual regions inside the mega region and broadly across kind of national averages, we project about 900,000 people will be housed through kind of continued natural densification. That leaves 1.3 million people, which is a pretty astounding number. I think that's greater than the population of the city of Vancouver right now, the actual city itself. Where, where do we put them? And that decision fundamentally, in my opinion, is the core of what will impact, where do we end up by 2050 on the previous page. One idea, one bold idea, quite frankly, is this concept of hub cities. So hub cities are cities that are built on underdeveloped land, 40 to 100 miles from an urban core. They are connected by high-speed transit and then interconnected inside of them by multimodal local transit. They house a pretty significant number of people and relative density. These are not sprawling suburb bedroom communities by any means. And perhaps most importantly, they have about 150 to 200,000 jobs per hub. In other words, this is a place where you live, you work, but more importantly, the ability of high-speed transit to effectively shrink the distance from these hub cities to their urban cores enables you to house people and for them to be able to transit when necessary and still have that connectivity instead of kind of like this continuing sprawl that other regions have experienced. Kate and Alan will get into some of the details of the vision here, but I do want to kind of tee this up as an idea and a big picture idea, but really I think a fundamental core opportunity for our mega region as we look towards the future. Next slide, please. A couple slides ago, we saw the current trajectory we're on and where we're going to be by 2050, and I think it's fair to say it's not a vision of a place that almost any of us would want to live in. But with all that said, I personally am pretty optimistic right now. The fact that we're already having these discussions, the fact that we're tapping into what makes Cascadia a great mega region, the innovation, the can-do spirit, the recognition of what really matters, gives me a lot of hope that we can solve some of these really fundamental structural issues over the next 30 years. And keep in mind, these are massive problems to solve. It does not like we can wait until 2048 to solve them. We have to start today. And so with that, I will pause and pass it over to, I believe, Alan to start, or excuse me, maybe it's Kate to start jumping.
It's me. I think I'm next.
Okay. Great.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to turn my camera on for a few seconds, but my computer's telling me my network is unstable, so I'm going to turn it off and just focus on the slides if you don't mind. So here we go. So I'm going to focus on an integrated vision for Cascadia, building on our past, but also looking to the future. As a region, we share a First Nations heritage, the coastal mountain range, the Great Columbia watershed, the Salish Sea, earthquakes, volcanoes, all sorts of wonderful stuff, and a lifestyle that we've got used to. But as well, next slide, please. We have a long history of sustainable growth and leadership in shaping that growth. Oregon, for instance, next slide. Please, thank you. Oregon is a comprehensive, developed a comprehensive growth management program in 1973. Vancouver, not long afterwards, developed the Vancouver Livable Region Plan in 1976. And Washington State developed the GMA, the Growth Management Act, in 1990, which is a very progressive document as well. Next slide, please. And all of these plans really focused on maintaining and and preserving our environment. Next slide, please. And they did that by really focusing on balancing the various aspects, the land use, transportation plan, land use planning, and dealing with them as a cause of an effect, one affecting the other, and making sure that we set boundaries of growth, not just growth goals, but boundaries of growth to protect the various aspects of our region that we value. Next slide. One of the important parts is to create inclusive housing choices, diverse housing choices that have a limited footprint, that reduce sprawl, but provide the sort of housing opportunities that people need. People from all, economic and different ages as well. Next slide, please. And this is based on providing diverse, equitable transportation choices to get from one place to another that have limited impacts or lesser impacts on the environment and our way of life. Next slide. And the intent of this balanced approach is to really also maintain our agricultural, our farmland, and in turn provide food independence. Next slide. And these plans also really focus on the economic aspects of it, a diverse and inclusive employment, whether it's white collar or farm or blue collar work. It's all key to create a diverse and sustainable economic growth. Next slide, please. But one thing that's really important to understand is the funding and jurisdictional nature of each of these components. Transportation in both countries, in Canada and the United States, tends to be federal and state or provincially legislated and funded. Whereas the planning of the land use of our towns and communities are actually planned by the towns and cities that we live in. And then the regional bodies tend to be, in our region, they tend to be stronger than other regions, but they tend to be the intermediaries, the organizations that establish the networks, the systems, the policies that we all try to plan to. Next slide, please. And so the integrated, and how do we achieve that is by really taking an integrated approach of dealing with these things all simultaneously and incrementally. And so, for instance, taking transportation, we really focus on moving and connecting people to where they want to go to and where they want to come from, developing partnerships between towns and between agencies to make sure that that first and last mile connection is achieved. Next slide, please. And that our desire to create, maintain and create equitable communities, focusing on diversity and inclusion, and making sure that we're creating communities for all. Next slide. And these plans also really focus on the future. They project out numbers of years, 2040, 2050, so that we can begin, as Eric starts pointing to, really understanding the consequences of our decisions and starting to plan significant infrastructure that will support and grow the region the way we want. Next slide, please. And as I said, the integrated approach is that you don't take one of these independently, but really have to see all of these objectives together and balance them as we look forward. Next slide, please. And so that the idea, this is a graphic that we use quite often to say that really, in order to create the future that's at the top of the slide, we really have to understand the assets, the mobility, the access, the zoning simultaneously in our communities in order to create places where we can live sustainably, live and work sustainably. Next slide. And this has actually been done in each of the major cities that make up this region, Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland, where each of them are a multinodal, as Eric pointed out, kind of a hub city approach. We're already doing that. This is an image of Vancouver. The next slide, please. This is Portland, same principle, where you have a network of transportation that connects the various nodes, and the planning of these communities are done in concert with each other. Next slide. And this is Seattle. And as the networks, transportation networks, the opportunities for growing these communities, these networks also grow. But you have to have the vision of that in the future in order to actually, for the communities to be able to work in concert. Next slide, please. So when you start looking at this, growing this to a Cascadian vision, the way Eric was suggesting, now all of a sudden, all of these communities, big and small, start working together. And so then now these networks are networks within networks, and the opportunities start becoming exponential. Next slide, please. And by adding a significant infrastructure of getting people from one to the other, now all of a sudden those smaller transportation networks now become part of a much larger transportation strategy. So you could, next slide, please. So you can begin to live, let's say, in Seattle and work in Bellevue. You can live in Portland and work in Bremerton, or even work in Tacoma, and on and on. And so, as I said, the opportunities become more and more, which then allows for a choice of housing and hopefully starts moving it to a much more economic model than we have been trending towards. Next slide, please. And then if we do this utilizing the frameworks of that the legislation in each of the states and provinces that we live in, we then can begin to also protect this amazing environment, this extraordinary environment we live in and that we cherish, and also begin to reduce our carbon footprint and really start moving towards contributing to our fight of climate change, as Eric mentions as well. So on that note, I think that's my last slide. Next slide. It'll tell me that if, yeah, it is. Well, thank you very much. And I think next is Kate.
You're muted, Kate.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We have seen the plan, and I've been thinking about how are we going to talk to people about the plan and its vision and get their support and their buy-in. Next, please. So our challenge, as they would say in Mission Impossible, it's going to be Mission Possible. Our challenge, should we choose to accept it, is no less than building a regional consensus on growth. So next. And this is not a small challenge by any means. We need to talk to a few folks, about 9 million or so of them, and as the governor said, another 3 or 4 million of those in addition, and all our governments and their elected officials and a number of tribal nations, military installations, 164 cities and towns, and. So how do we start? And more importantly, who has done this successfully already? What can we learn? And what ideas can we steal? And being us, what can we do better? Next, please. So I've looked around with 2 examples to just start our conversation. So the first one I'm going to talk about was started about 20 years ago. A lot of you know about it, but it probably still is the gold standard for how do you do large scale engagement over a big geography. In 1997, a group of concerned community, government, business leaders came together to form Envision Utah. It's a nonprofit that engages Utahns in collaborative, bottom-up decision-making about the future of their communities. It's still probably the most successful example particularly of a sustained and effective effort to engage thousands of people in developing a consensus on growth. The Envision Utah plan had surveys, outreach, and engagement at every step of the plan, which was really key. They did a lot of outreach when they launched the project. They did a ton of engagement when they were creating their alternatives for growth strategies. They talked to lots of people when they were developing their preferred growth strategy, and they kept up a high volume of communication when they were talking about implementation. And they also noted, which we do too, the more people know about what we're trying to do, then people who are not that crazy about it come up too. So you need to double down on communication through every section of your plan. Next, please. The second example that I want to talk a little bit about is a project that just started this year. When Governor Newsom came in, he said that housing and transportation are intertwined. You can't deal with one without the other. That is why the California State Transportation Agency and a lot of the housing agencies in the state have joined to provide guidance, support, and a toolkit to regional agencies, local governments, developers, nonprofit groups, and other organizations in their state to help them have conversations at the local level about growth. And they have 3 goals for this project. One, they want to build awareness, particularly because communities are really concerned about the impacts of growth, and if you have housing and transportation strategies on their community character, and they want to promote the potential benefits of affordable and transportation efficient housing. That's the core of their communications mission. They want to build sustainable support, broad and sustainable support across all the regions in California. And they literally want to transform the paradigm of single-family homes and single occupancy vehicles to mixed-use housing types and alternative transportation options. Very similar to the we will need to have. Next, please. So a couple of things we can learn for both of the projects as we're starting to think about the regional conversation we need to have. First, it has to come from the communities. It has to come bottom up. Second, we have been blessed with strong leadership on this project so far to date, but you need to have strong leadership that will continue to stick with the project over the long term. We've all seen a lot of projects where you have great leaders show up for the press conference and then you don't see them afterwards. One of the fundamentals, particularly for Envision Utah, is that leadership was there for the long term. The partners need to be broad and inclusive, and the organization needs to be nimble and creative. Can't create a bureaucracy to implement our strategy. And, I think a lot about the very nature of what a fact is has been totally denigrated in the last couple of years. But some of the opposition to growth strategies is based on misconceptions. So really good facts, really good analysis at the local level for people's communities, and excellent visuals so people can see what it might look like for the kind of growth that we're trying to achieve. And finally, most important, as George Duff said to me once, a great leader many of you know, he said, in our business, Kate, we are talking to a parade, not a static group. So we need to be continually communicating. And so this has to be a really robust communication effort over the long term. Next, please. So both of these projects started with a listening tour, and this is where we will have to start. The temptation is always to go out and tell people what great work we have been doing, but we are really going to need to listen first. Envision Utah started by interviewing 150 people in 6 months, and they asked everyone 3 questions. 1, do you believe a process to coordinate future growth would be helpful? 2, will you support this project? And 3, who should be involved in this process to ensure its worth and its success? These interviews and the time it took to do it really yielded important feedback on how to proceed and what obstacles might occur. The next, please. One of the things that both projects learned, but the California H+T project is really taking into account, is that while there are benefits for all communities, they're different. And we as a group tend to be pretty urban centric, but we need to listen to diverse voices throughout our region in order to craft our messages. Some examples from the H+T California project. In the suburbs, the message that people want to talk about is efficient travel. How do you reduce the number of cars? How do you improve the flow of traffic? In the dense urban areas, the conversation, because not everyone is going to afford a single family home, it's all about transportation options. What are the transit options going to be and how broad are they going to be? What is car share? What is bike? What does PED look like? In the rural areas, and taking into account, like for us, many of California's small towns were established long supremacy of the automobile. So providing valid alternatives to single car trips that reduces the impact on their local roads and helps to preserve and restore the unique character of their rural towns is one way to start talking to rural communities in something that they really value. Next slide, please. We need to build, to do this, an army of advocates throughout the region, and we need to give them tools to talk to their communities. Because as the governor noted, ultimately it's local officials who will be responsible for making quality growth a reality through updating general plans, through revising codes and ordinances, planning new and innovative developments in their communities. So recognizing this, both the California H+T process and Envision Utah work closely with local city councils, planning commissions, mayors, county commissioners, planners, and other elected and appointed officials, inviting them to meetings, seeking input, requesting support, and giving them the tools to educate their communities in the process. In fact, Envision Utah focuses much of its efforts on educating and providing both financial and technical assistance to the willing and enthusiastic municipalities to promote quality growth. And that's who's going to be our very first team, those of the willing. And the kind of things that Envision Utah is doing in their outreaches, they're helping communities do visioning workshops. They're applying assistance to regional planning agencies. They're helping with zoning reviews and plan preparations. They're overseeing general plan updates and looking at evaluations, and they're helping communities with sensitive and open lands evaluation. Some examples of the forums that they have done in the past, they've done one on public safety and street design. They've done a density versus design forum. I bet that one was kind of hot. They've done a tax structure forum. They've done affordable housing forum. So they tried to really give tools at the local level to help communities talk about growth in a rational and productive way. So next. There are great and evolving tools to hold community brainstorming meetings. This is what you're looking at right now. This is a picture of a Zoom meeting using a software that works very much like the in-person brainstorming that we've all done. You go to the workshop, you get a pile of Post-it notes, you write things on the Post-it notes, you go up to the front, you post them on the paper. Well, this is a virtual Post-it note project you can do on Zoom with a couple hundred people. It uses virtual Post-it notes that can be put up on the screen and rearranged into themes in real time. And there are lots of tools like this. So, and actually, it's ironic, I think. I believe our chances of engaging local leaders is greater now because you think of trying to get a meeting of mayors in a region, it would take them all a half a day to set aside to drive to the meeting and all the hassles of that, where the chances of getting them all on an hour on Zoom right now are probably pretty good. So, this means for this project, we can probably start now. Next slide, please. And that means the future is really in our hands now, and it's up to us. Thank you. Paula,
Thank
to you.
Hello, I'm here. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It's been really gratifying to see all the comments and conversation that's going on in the chat room. So I have been picking through the questions and combined some that are similar, and I'm going to invite, I'm hearing a feedback, I'm going to invite our panelists to join in, any of them, if they have a suggested response. So let me start with the question that came up early. Where are these existing undeveloped areas that might grow into hub cities? And I know it's too soon to name a spot on the map, but how should those hub cities be developed is the question. And I guess we'll stop there. Any of our panelists want to talk about how those kinds of hub cities might take shape?
Maybe I could start with a bit of the conceptual framing, and then would love to hear from the other panelists their thought. You know, if we look globally at other examples of hub cities and what has been successful, we see underdeveloped areas, largely kind of rural. Like I said, 40 to 100 miles away is the distance that enables you to enable that connectivity back to the core in a sufficiently short amount of time that you actually gain the benefits. Too far away, you lose all the benefits, right? Too close, you're basically already back in developed land territory and you don't realize the full benefits of those hub cities. And so I certainly don't want to start naming specific geographies as we think about that, but I think the real value is potentially looking for opportunities in that band, most importantly along the high-speed transit corridor connecting the mega region from north to south there. And by the way, it doesn't have to stop at Vancouver. Potentially you can continue north. Similarly for Portland to the south. I think Seattle, you obviously get, based on its location, the ability to go both directions on the high-speed transit corridor.
There was some encouragement in the chat room for us to be bold and name those spots, but it's interesting when you think about Kate's presentation about engagement. I think it would be irresponsible for our committee and the Cascadia Innovation Steering Committee to start declaring where these kinds of hub cities might be without the proper amount of engagement with community leaders, land use, all of the notions that those communities and areas have their own vision for growth. I don't think this can be done, which is why it's so important for us to have the engagement begin and a robust conversation about how cities, small cities, counties, etc., see their vision, what it is they want to grow into, and how they want to work with the concept of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor to make these developments possible. Does any of the other panelists want to add to that, or should we?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that. I think, Paula, on that basis, my tendency is that the concept of Hub City is a wonderful one as something that a community may choose to want to be. But I think the idea is that you create the attributes of what that is, the vision of what that is, and then find if there is a community or stakeholders who would be interested in creating that. I'm not a big greenfield concept approach. I like to build on structure that's already there. So my tendency is that we be building it out of something that's somewhat there right now. And with the energy, as Kate was describing, with people behind the idea, it's more likely to happen.
Great point. And I think it was Alan who showed, there was a question about how you seed a hub city without a transit connection. I think the quick answer that Alan demonstrated was you don't. And as our committee has been doing our work on housing, transportation, and connectivity, we've done that alongside, but not integrated with the state and BC province and Oregon's work on the ultra high speed corridor. So we know this project is taking shape for high speed rail or some kind of ultra high speed transport that would be the underpinning for most of what we're talking about today. And as Alan described, the connections within the regions of TransLink, Sound Transit, and TriMet in Portland really make those connections possible when you get to the larger cities. Does anybody else want to add to that on our panel?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Paula. I would also say to the question about seeding, though, is you can't wait until you have the high-speed transit in place and then start thinking about hub cities, right? It has to be a parallel process where you look for core tenants, for example, for a hub city, and almost industry clusters. That can be through public institutions. Universities have been a common theme among some of the other a few of the other successful hub cities, or obviously a like large business. We have some good examples around this region, obviously, who are interested in concepts like this. And fundamentally, it has to go in parallel. There has to be that vision as you're developing in order to create the ROI to putting the high-speed transit in place in the first place.
Great, thank you. There was a question about how you sell the notion of quality of life. As one of the underpinnings too that we consider is that the Great Pacific Northwest, Cascadia, is a place where people really want to live and work. Could somebody talk about that? Do you try and prioritize the short commute concept, the housing affordability, climate? How would you describe that for our Cascadia vision?
Well, I don't think you have to sell it because communities will know what quality of life means. So you listen to them and make sure that that's in the plan. So people are joining this effort because they're going to achieve what they value locally. And I think, years of going out and talking to communities, I am never afraid that those visions are not going to be consistent with the kind of things we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that, is that you have to have that integral with your desired outcome and your measures of success. If you don't create that as a value that you're measuring, then you're not going to achieve it.
And it's going to be different, like I talked about when you're talking about suburban areas, dense urban areas, and rural areas. The quality of life fundamentally is going to be the same at the end of the day, but in tactics may look different. And so we have to be aware of that.
Great, thank you. The next question was, how can we better engage Portland and Oregon in this effort? A question we've actually asked ourselves. And really it describes the notion of how long is the Cascadia Innovation Corridor? Does it stop at Portland? Does it go down the Willamette Valley to Eugene? I would say just from the work that's being done on the ultra high speed corridor, certainly the conversation has come up that the high speed transportation should not just stop at Portland. I believe that for the definition of our mega region for now, that the bundling of the three major urban cities has been the defining boundaries. But Eric, maybe you'd like to talk about that. the concept of how big the mega region gets over time. Someone even asked about whether it should be east of the Cascades. So I'll leave it to perhaps Eric and Alan to discuss, and anybody else that wants to join in.
This is a tough one for sure, Paula. So if you look at trends of other mega regions across the country and across the globe, like there is a historical, undeniable trend of growth of those mega regions. And that is in large part organic and secular, not like a let's start increasing our boundaries, because we want to. And so, I think a lot of thought has to go into what is the natural boundary of connectivity here? Other mega regions use economic growth as kind of their core tenet, and quite frankly, I think Cascadia is that, and the other aspects that make our region great, things like sustainability, the panels or the committee rather that Kevin and Paul are leading, and so I'm certainly not going to try to redraw the boundaries of Cascadia, and maybe Greg or Governor Gregoire could talk about their concept of that, but I think the idea, the principle that should guide those boundaries is where is there benefit to the broader mega region in terms of increasing. And we mentioned going north of Vancouver as a potential option, and I think certainly valuable to explore going south and think about that connectivity from a broader mega regional standpoint. But again, I don't want to address the definitional nature of Cascadia specifically.
Yeah, I'll take that on a little bit. My sense is that you begin with what is achievable. You incrementally increase the size of the area as you build on success. And I think that's what we've been able to do in the past. And those are all very good questions, whether we go across the mountains or how far south, how far north. But I think that if we begin with the three regions that have been, the three cities that have been the major leaders in sustainable growth, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, with all the other communities in between, would be a good place to start.
Great, thank you. Kylie, we're seeing a weird screen on our, maybe I'm the only one, but someone's sharing.
No, that's not just you. We could ask everyone to just double check that they are not sharing their screen. I think we have a guest potentially sharing their screen.
Yeah, and turn off their cameras.
Yes, please. There we go.
Whatever it was, it looked interesting. Thank you. I'd like to delve into an area that I think is interesting. We've had several comments around this. Partly it started with the notion of affordability for housing. And who are we talking about? We have a lot of tech workers in this universe, and we know that those earning potentials are quite different from our underserved communities who are service workers, et cetera, who are already struggling with affordability in our major cities. So it really raises this issue of equity and access for all, which bleeds into the notion of how do we engage those communities, and what does that conversation look like to rebuild the trust perhaps that some of those communities really need when they're dealing with some concepts of growth and development, et cetera, and how those might affect their lives and how what's being envisioned can benefit their lives. So Kate, you touched on that. Could you spend a minute talking about that, and I'll invite anyone else to join in as well?
Yeah, I can. And it goes back to really listening to each community and what they value and where they are, because that's right. Housing affordability is going to differ dramatically from Bellingham to Seattle to Portland to Vancouver. And it's going to mean different things to different people. And I've seen literature, when you connect communities with high-speed transit, the definition of affordable housing gets even more complicated because people are able to work, much farther away. But for this one, I'm going to pick on Kevin a little bit, because one of the things I was really struck about the Vancouver region is how the communities in your region really embraced growth. I mean, the kind of density that communities in the Vancouver region are doing is kind of stunning to people in the US. And so I would like to know more about that, actually. Yep, and you're muted this time. Kevin, you're muted.
Sorry. I was just going to say I'm going to dodge that and probably ask Alan to answer that question as well, because he's pretty well grounded in it, and his slides talked about it. If you looked at that growth plan from the mid-1970s in Vancouver, it started all those years ago, and I think a culture and an ethic grew up around. At a point in time, it was about a highway project, like it so often happens in cities, that communities rose up and said, no, we're not going to build a highway right through downtown Vancouver. And they kind of rejected a highway culture. And that started to put in motion this notion of creating higher density hubs connected by high capacity transit. And then I think from a governance structure in terms of how land use has played out over many different years, and then how mobility plans have actually played out over many different different years, resulted in these various different sub-hubs where there's more density in that area, where agricultural lands are preserved. There is an agricultural land reserve policy, so there's a lot of farming land still preserved in what would otherwise been built up urban areas. So it goes back 4 or 5 decades of an ethic, and the planning then proceeded from that basis, and clearly a greater willingness in the Vancouver region to live in dense housing. But Alan, I think you probably might have a little bit better perspective on how the Vancouver model has played out over the years and what that might mean for U.S. communities.
There you go. My computer's a little bit slow, so hopefully you can hear me. Interestingly, the regional livable region plan really set the stage, because by having limits to growth, we had to focus our growth in very specific areas. So there wasn't a choice. We couldn't start pointing somewhere else. The rules were that we had to find a way to find ways to house people. We also, in Vancouver, didn't talk about density in the same. We tended to talk about it in terms of housing choices and having a place to live, and different models of, we tried co-ops and we tried different things. We were a lot more progressive in the early days than we are now. The very problems that we're running into in Vancouver right now about affordability and younger and older people not having a chance to be able to stay in their homes or find homes was the reason why we started looking at density in the first place. So I think going back to our roots in both sides of the border of really looking at inclusion, equity, and choice is really how we start really justifying the idea of densification. I hate the word, dislike the word densification, because it tends to sound as if that's the goal in itself. But the goal is really providing housing for young people, for older people, be able to age in place, to be able to have economically available housing and working opportunities. Those are the goals about trying to limit your footprint. So that's the context I would put it in.
Governor, your hand's up. Did you want to join in? Unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to get in and realized I was having a wonderful conversation with myself earlier when the question, it went well, by the way.
I was going to say.
But anyway, the question was asked about whether we redefine Cascadia. let me just share, I don't think that's in the cards for us because we had nothing whatsoever to do with this. This was done at an international level. It has been in existence for years. Nobody has paid the kind of attention that we are now. So we have focused on it. So I don't know that that's probably in the cards for us. Having said that, however, the question I think was more related to should the high-speed transportation be extended beyond Portland? And when Greg and I met with the governor, she was very, very keen on that. And furthermore, wanted to consult with California with the potential of beyond. But the conclusion of our conversation was, let's begin with the Cascadia corridor and look to that as a future for you to plan, because that's what she wants to do. That's her big picture view of what she'd like to achieve. So I hope that helps.
And I think, Paula, just to buttress Governor Gregoire's comments, is that the challenge is when something is really exciting and you've got something good going, people want in, which is really a credit to the people in thinking and planning on this call. So the governor and I have talked to people in Calgary, Alberta, which there's a little, probably 4 mountain ranges away, and others that really want to think about the Cascadia opportunity. And so I think, we'll talk about this over the next couple of minutes, but, there really is a geographic boundary that others have defined. And I think we've got some complexity and opportunity that if we can focus on that corridor today, that it'll be a learning tool for others going forward. It may expand over time, but we've got these immediate challenges that Eric laid out in his presentation and that Kate talked about in terms of engaging communities. So my view, which I think is shared by the governor, is let's focus on what is right in front of us and think about the vision and the plan going forward. And if we're successful, it may expand over the course of time, and we'll have been able to lead and inform that expansion.
Perfect. Thank you both for jumping in on that. There was a question about what is the status of the project that is the ultra high speed ground transportation. And I would just offer that the project that is being sponsored by Washington State DOT, British Columbia Ministry of Transport, Oregon DOT, and has also been financially supported a few times from Microsoft, thank you very much, it's truly been an exploratory opportunity. This last year or current year, they've been working on governance models that might perhaps be the organizing, authorizing group that would implement an ultra high speed ground transportation. They've been working on financial models. How would something like that come together? And they've also begun that really important, as Kate mentioned, engagement plan to strategize on a next step of starting to, from the project side, engage with the community. And I would just remind folks that the Cascadia Innovation Corridor Steering Committee and the group that Kevin and I, the subgroup committee that we chair, is led by the business arm of the Challenge Seattle and the Business Council of British Columbia. But we engage with the governments on both sides, and it's inclusive, and yet we don't want to step on the government role of the work that's being done right now. So we've been very carefully aligning and alongside working with them. At some point, we see these two groups merging to really accomplish the kinds of envisioning that we've been doing. But for now, it would be inappropriate for us to try and tell that project how to do its work, but to help support with community engagement, business engagement, bring the business community to the table in this conversation so that we really can have a well-represented conversation about leading this concept into the future. There was a question, interestingly enough, there's been a lot more attention being paid, at least in Washington, about advanced air mobility. And could those vehicles be instead of for a high-speed rail or along with? Do any of the panelists have an idea about other kinds of transportation connections and links that might supersede the need for high-speed rail, or what? Anybody want to offer?
Sure, I could start here. And actually, Paula, I'd like to expand the scope a little bit because I saw some other questions around future mobility options, autonomous vehicles, et cetera. So urban air mobility or advanced air mobility, I think could be thought of certainly as a beneficial integrated piece of this. But if I look at all the projections, all the broadly agreed to projections on penetration and the cost and et cetera, the technology, I think that by 2050 we're just not looking at a sufficient amount of throughput for air mobility to really move the needle in a meaningful way. There are very specific and very valuable use cases for it, but I just think it's not a replacement or a major lever that changes it, but is like valuable. The other piece on future mobility, as we look, for example, that 2050 projection, all that includes all the latest projections on autonomous vehicle adoption, on benefits in terms of traffic and parking and affordability. Like everything is tied up into, and we're still going the wrong direction. And so I just want to make it clear, like, we are not going to technology our way out of this problem on the current trajectory we're on. We've got to do something to change that trajectory.
Would anybody like to talk about how the pandemic has changed perhaps
I think Paula froze up there. We probably know where she was going with that. I'll complete her sentence. So how
I'm back,
the
thank you.
pandemic. All right, finish your sentence then. I was helping
well, no,
you out.
I
finished each
that
other's
you can
sentences.
now finish mine. That's pretty good. So I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. It says I have bad network. Kevin, go ahead, and I'm going to try and fix this.
I think where Paula was going was how do we, the pandemic, I mentioned that in my opening remarks as well, how that may change the thinking associated with this corridor concept and the hub city concept. As running our transit agency in Vancouver, not only are we thinking, well, what happens to transit over the next couple of years in transit ridership, this future of work, this notion that you don't necessarily have to be as tethered to a city. And in fact, what's the future of urban areas? So maybe for the panelists, opine a little bit over not just the next year and the 2 years, but as we see this playing out over the 30 years, does the experience we've now been enduring for these past 7-8 months with the pandemic, does it open our thinking a little bit more for the corridor development of where jobs may emerge in the future, and therefore how you interact with jobs, and therefore where you live? So hopefully, Paula, that was where you were going with the question, but panelists, thoughts about that?
Thank you.
Well, since I work with a lot of downtowns around the country, people are looking at their downtowns right now and seeing only 20% of the people that used to work there coming to work every day, and are wondering what work is going to be like in the future. But if you listen to all the big institutional investors on the office side, the current polling says 90% of people want to come back to an office setting to work. And there are a lot of ways. It's office culture, it's mentoring, it's collaboration, all those kind of things that we have lost in Zoom world. But the caveat is that 75% of people want to have flexible work time. And so what the big office investors are looking at is the three places: the office, which may be in a dense area, which is for collaboration, mentoring, the team culture. The third place, which is maybe in a different place, connected by transit, that may be a conference center or a Starbucks near home, and your home. So I think all of that plays into the hub city concept, because I think it's much more flexible. And I guess parallel with that, You see very interesting things happening around the country, like Tulsa, giving $10,000 to people who can work remotely but would love to live in a better, smaller quality of life. So there's a lot of people talking about, I don't think dense urban cities are going to empty out. There's something hardwired to humans about the marketplace and the vitality, but they might look a little bit different. But for so-called inappropriately named second and third tier cities that have a good quality of life, affordable housing, good universities, I think there's a lot of opportunities there too. And I think that also supports the thinking that we're going to do about hub city opportunities.
Yeah, I tend to build on that, what Kate said. I think it'll tend to modify the situation as opposed to radically change it. I think affordability is going to be a major part of this moving forward, and also availability of people working. So the idea of being able to have the ability to reach out to smaller communities to find people to work for your company or whatever becomes, you can start doing that in a more strategic way. That will allow for a lot of opportunities in the future to start rethinking how we do things. But I don't think at the core aspect, cities have been with us for a long time, towns have, because we're just naturally social beings. And just for that reason, I don't think we're going to see a radical change of human settlement.
Great. We have one last question that perhaps might be more appropriate for Governor Gregoire and Greg. Most innovation corridors are anchored by top research universities. And could you talk a little bit about how the Cascadia Innovation Corridor is not just looking at the issues that Kevin and my committee are working on, but how that includes universities and other.
Chris, do you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in?
Go ahead, Greg.
One of the most exciting things, I think, from my perspective around the Cascadia Innovation Corridor and the work that all of us have been doing collectively is that probably as quickly as any group of people, our research universities came together to form really deep and connected relationships. So we've got an ecosystem now of University of BC and the University of Washington, two of the top 20 public schools in the world. We've got Wazoo and SFU and UVic, but we also have an amazing network of technical colleges and institutions working together on how do we actually do primary research and then apply it in a commercialized way to solve the big challenges we've got, not just in the region, but globally. And most importantly, how do we create the talent necessary up and down the corridor to be able to fuel the future and ensure that we've got talent that can actually drive sustainability and have jobs and quality of life that we're all seeking going forward. So at a personal level, at a academic discipline level, and at a problem-solving level, there's some great work being done, but the governor can speak on some of her perspective, given her involvement in UW and other institutions in Washington State.
So thanks, Greg. And Paula, to your point, absolutely well taken. We do not know of a mega region that isn't in large part driven by major research institutions. We don't know of international cities where they don't have the resources and the economic engine of a major research university. So that is true of British Columbia. It is also true of what we have here in Seattle and greater Seattle and frankly across the state. Same is true in Oregon. And so you can see why these cities were chosen and why Cascadia was put together. It's not as if it was in isolation without factoring in those research universities. The next webinar we're going to have, for example, is how do we address urban smoke? And what we found is we have one of the best forestry schools in the country in Vancouver, one of the best, and another that is really highly regarded in the University of Washington and in Oregon. So we put them together, and together they're coming up with amazing ideas. So we really, as we move forward with this big idea, want to engage urban planning, want to engage all of those research opportunities. And the universities have expressed a unbelievable interest and willingness to partner with us on whatever we want to do, because they want to be a part of it. They know their future lies in what we're talking about as well. And they're struggling with the exact same issues that we are struggling with: affordable housing and homelessness and congestion and emissions. And so they want to be a part. And Greg and I all the way along have said, we have got to have them be a bold part of every vision. And this one is key and at the forefront.
Thank you. The mantra that we're better together certainly plays out in each of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor committees. The ideas that come up have been just tremendous. And I want to thank everybody for the questions today. I'm going to turn the closing over to Greg Davignon, who's the President and CEO of the Business Council of British Columbia. And he is the co-chair alongside Governor Gregoire of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor Steering Committee. Greg?
Well, thank you so much, Paula. And listen, before I jump into just concluding remarks, I want to thank specifically Paula and Kevin. Both of them stepped up to provide leadership as co-chairs on what I think is probably one of the most crucial elements of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, and that's how we move and how we live and how we work together up and down the corridor. And as the governor has said repeatedly to me, we've got this common ethos. We even laugh at the same jokes in the same way, but it takes leadership and infrastructure and planning, as we've heard. And I would just want to acknowledge the volunteer leadership that Kevin and Paul have provided, and all those people involved in the committee work that they have been leading, as well as you on this conversation today. We're going to need all of you to really exact the opportunity we've got in front of us. Specifically, I want to thank Kate and Alan and Eric today for your work and leadership and just the amazing insights you provided to inform the conversation, that provided both challenges that we've got to face that are coming at us and we can't ignore, but also the potential opportunities that we've got and solutions we can lean on here, but also as examples to the world as Cascadia grows as a global center for innovation, for talent, and for investment and technology, where we can draw people to this region, but also share that experience and entrepreneurism with the rest of the world as we find our way through these solutions. When we have a sustainable region with options for connectivity, housing, transportation, which support the movement of good ideas and people, we further differentiate ourselves and have the ability to attract capital and depth the talent necessary to contribute to our communities and sustainable growth. And as we heard, the quality of life I think we're all seeking. And there's so many opportunities. We talk about technology regularly, but it's a horizontal that cuts across everything from our natural resources, our ports and transportation exports, life sciences, climate research, agri-food and agri-tech, and higher education, as we just talked about. But it really takes vision to bring those things together, and planning and leadership. And as we've heard today, we're at a nexus, I think, as Eric talked about, on how we inform what that sustainable future looks like going forward. And that leadership means that, as Alan noted, it's going to take some vision and planning. And we've been so blessed, I think, in this region, as Alan laid out in his presentation, that we've had that now for probably 5 decades. You know, I think back to people like Mayor Art Phillips in the city of Vancouver that led some of that discussion about not being a freeway city, and other leaders, including my co-chair and friend Chris Gregoire, who have just demonstrably impacted the way that we live and work and the future that we've got in front of us. The one thing that we've heard today repeatedly, and I think we heard it from Kate and Spades, is that we've got to work together at the local, at the state, regional, and federal levels. And the Business Council isn't a partisan organization, but we're both experiencing elections in front of us as we speak. They both culminate near the end of the month. So we've got to vote for a future which embraces collaboration among governments, visionary leaders, and citizens, all working together so that we can really aspire to the opportunity in front of us. So despite the outcomes of the obligations, I think this group and collectively the broader group of Cascadia that continues to grow have a real obligation and opportunity to inform the future, or as Kate said, to help lead the parade and give people the tools necessary to succeed. So just a couple of takeaways I heard. One is that we're going to have massive growth whether we plan for it or not. But if we don't, it will come at the cost of livability, affordability, and the potential of people and equity in our region. The second is that we have the ability to, as Kate said, engage communities. How do we make sure that communities feel like they have the ability to chart their vision for their own people and society and give them the tools to help inform that vision so we can plan, engage, and coordinate and collaborate on everything from zoning to the things that we need to be successful. And there's no doubt we're going to have conversation about values, we're going to have conversation about timing, we're going to have conversation about technology and the evolution of it. But I think the more we can engage and this group can bring people together, the more successful we're going to be. And I think the last piece that Alan talked about is just the coordination of all of those levels of government. How do we actually inform elected officials and governments that we need longer term plans? Today, politics is often rewarded with short-term thinking. I reflect back on as a kid growing up in the Eastern Fraser Valley at Chilliwack, which is the equivalent to Vancouver as Mount Vernon is to Seattle. And the fastest growing regions now in Greater Vancouver area are areas that we would never thought of as connected hubs and drivers of innovation and recipients of population growth. And so how do we connect those folks in a meaningful way and really maintain that quality of life? So despite the uncertain times, we've got great opportunity, and this is a platform to bring more people into the conversation to drive a vibrant economy, vibrant neighborhoods, vibrant region. And it's all going to come down to us on this call today, working together. So just a couple of things before we go. We've got a few more sessions coming up that I would encourage you and or your network of people to engage in. On October the 27th, we've had a couple changes to our calendar because of demand and opportunity. On October 27th, we're going to have, as the governor talked about, a wildfires and urban smoke, no borders. And so the conversation is about broader collaboration on research and management approaches to some of the things we've been experiencing over the last couple of weeks and months. It's a 90-minute virtual forum which will feature presentations from members of the Wildfire Working Group, which is a collaboration among post-secondary institutions within the corridor. And the presentations will share their research findings and be followed by group discussion and Q&A as we've experienced today. Then on November 20th, that was originally going to be in October, we're going to have a conversation, Local Farms, COVID-19 and the Future of Sustainability. And it's hosted by Dr. Ricky Yatta, who's the Dean of UBC Faculty of Land and Food Systems and co-chair of Cascadia's Subcommittee on Sustainable Agriculture. We talked a little bit about, I saw in the comments today, on food sustainability. And then early in the new year, we're going to share details of our next round of virtual forums, which will include a discussion on growing life sciences clusters in the Cascadia region. And as Governor Gregoire and I know, just really interesting sharing of information and collaboration as we faced COVID and the opportunities around therapeutics and the ability to keep people and communities safe. So as a reminder, you can find the Cascadia 2050 report that we alluded to earlier and that BCG informed, as well as our recordings of the virtual forums, including today's forum, which are available at our website, connectcascadia.com. That's connectcascadia.com. And I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in today's conversation. It's always so exciting to see the enthusiasm and the ideas that people come together to share and that we can act on. Again, thanks to Paula and Kevin for bringing us together in this esteemed group of speakers that really challenged our thinking and informed us. And I want to thank, again, Eric, Alan, and Kate for sharing their insights and advance the opportunities of the corridor. And of course, to my partner in crime, Governor Gregoire, who is just a real inspiration for me and for all of us in terms of realizing the opportunity we've got working together. So have a safe weekend, and for Canadians, enjoy Thanksgiving, and we'll look forward to engaging you at our next session. Thanks so much for joining us today.